Hey everyone, tonight I want you to imagine walking into a room and immediately knowing someone is about to die. Not because of what you see, but because of what you smell. I know that sounds insane, but stick with me here. We're so used to thinking about scent as this innocent thing, right? Your perfume, your shampoo, maybe some cologne for a date. But what if I told you there was a time and place where smelling too good could literally get your head separated from your shoulders? Where wearing the wrong fragrance wasn't just a fashion faux pas, but a capital offense. Tonight we're diving into something that's going to change how you think about every spray bottle in your bathroom. We're talking about an empire so obsessed with controlling what people smelled like that they built an entire police state around your personal fragrance choices, where the difference between jasmine and rose could determine whether you lived to see another sunrise. Let me know in the comments what your favorite scent is and whether you've ever thought it might get you killed. Because honestly, after tonight, you might never smell frankincense the same way. And hey, maybe light a candle or some incense while we're talking about this. The irony will become clear soon enough. I need you to really think about this for a second. In our world, we spray on whatever we want whenever we want. Chanel, Bath and Body Works, that expensive stuff you save for special occasions. But imagine if every single drop of perfume you wore was being monitored by government agents. Imagine if your choice of body wash could be interpreted as an act of rebellion. Or worse, heresy. This isn't some dystopian fiction. This was everyday reality for millions of people living under one of history's most powerful empires. An empire that conquered half the known world but was terrified of its own citizens smelling too nice. So grab a blanket, dim the lights, and let me take you back to a time when your perfume choice could determine whether you lived to see tomorrow. We're heading to ancient Persia, where the wrong scent didn't just turn heads, it could cost you yours. You wake up in 520 BC in Persepolis, the jewel of the Achaemenid Empire. The sun is rising over the massive stone terraces, casting long shadows across what is essentially the ancient world's equivalent of Washington, D.C. If Washington, D.C. controlled territory from India to Greece. But here's the thing that hits you immediately: the smell. It's not just incense from the fire temples or the cooking fires from thousands of households. It's layers upon layers of deliberately crafted scent, each one carrying meaning, status, and danger in equal measure. See, the Persian Empire wasn't just big, it was massive. We're talking about ruling over 44% of the world's population at its peak. From the Indus Valley to the shores of the Mediterranean, from the steppes of Central Asia to the deserts of Egypt. And Persia wasn't just conquering these places. They were orchestrating the world's first global economy, with trade routes that made the Silk Road look like a neighborhood garage sale. And right at the heart of this economic web, perfume, spices, incense, the stuff that made people smell good. Think about Persian courts like if Beverly Hills had the power to execute you for your cologne choice. Except instead of just Beverly Hills, we're talking about an area larger than the continental United States, all operating under the same terrifyingly specific rules about what you were allowed to smell like. The Achaemenid Persians didn't just stumble into this obsession with scent. This was baked into their core religious beliefs through Zoroastrianism, a faith that saw the entire universe as locked in an eternal battle between good and evil, purity and contamination. And guess what was considered one of the primary battlegrounds? Your personal hygiene choices. Zoroastrians believed that certain scents could literally attract demons, while others could purify your soul. We're not talking metaphorically here. They genuinely believed that the wrong perfume could invite evil spirits to possess you. So from the government's perspective, regulating what people smelled like wasn't just about maintaining social order. It was about protecting the spiritual health of the entire empire. But here's where it gets really wild. Because Persia controlled most of the world's perfume trade routes, they had access to fragrances that people in other parts of the world could only dream of. Frankincense from Arabia, saffron from Kashmir, rose oil from Damascus, ambergris from Wales in the Indian Ocean. We're talking about substances so valuable that wars were fought over them. Substances that were literally worth more than gold. So you've got this empire that's swimming in the world's most luxurious perfumes, but also has a religious framework that says most scents are spiritually dangerous, combined with a political system that uses access to luxury goods as a way to control the population. It's like if Fort Knox was full of landmines instead of gold bars. Now, to understand just how deep this rabbit hole goes, we need to talk about Zoroaster, the prophet whose teachings became the foundation for how an entire empire thought about smell. And trust me, this guy had opinions. Zoroaster taught that the world was locked in this cosmic battle between Ahura Mazda, the god of light and truth, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit of darkness. But here's the kicker. This wasn't some abstract theological concept. According to Zoroastrian belief, this battle was happening every single day in the physical world. And one of the primary ways evil could infiltrate the material realm was through contamination. And what's one of the easiest ways to detect contamination? Through smell. Imagine if wearing the wrong deodorant was considered blasphemy. And you're starting to get the picture. The fire temples. And we're talking about thousands of these across the empire. Weren't just places of worship. They were essentially scent laboratories with priests who had spent decades learning to identify the spiritual properties of different fragrances. These guys could smell heresy on you from across a room, the sacred fire that burned in each temple. It had to be fed with specific types of incense at specific times, creating these incredibly complex aromatic signatures. Frankincense during morning prayers, sandalwood for purification rituals, cedar for protection ceremonies. Each temple had its own scent profile, and the priests could tell if someone had been attending the wrong temple just by how they smelled when they left. But it gets darker. See, the Zoroastrian concept of purity wasn't just about avoiding bad smells. It was about actively embracing the right ones. And the definition of right wasn't left up to individual interpretation. It was codified into religious law, which meant it was enforced by the state. Let me tell you about Varam, a spice merchant from Babylon. Now Babylon was this incredibly cosmopolitan city within the Persian Empire, a place where traders from all over the world would come to do business. Varam dealt in exotic musks from the northern territories, stuff that smelled absolutely incredible but wasn't on the approved list of Zoroastrian fragrances. One day, in 518 BCE, Varam made the mistake of wearing some of his own merchandise to a business meeting. Just a tiny dab of this rare musk behind his ears. The meeting was in Persepolis, and one of the other merchants happened to be a government informant. This informant smelled the musk, recognized it as non-approved, and reported Varam to the religious authorities. Now, you'd think maybe Varam would get a warning, or a fine, or maybe just be told to wash it off. But here's the thing about religious law enforcement in ancient Persia. They didn't mess around. Wearing unauthorized fragrances was considered a form of spiritual rebellion, and spiritual rebellion was treason against the cosmic order that the great king represented on earth. Varam was arrested, put on trial, and executed within a week. His crime? Smelling too good in the wrong way. The priests who made this decision weren't being cruel for the sake of it. In their worldview, they had just saved the empire from spiritual contamination. They genuinely believed that allowing unauthorized fragrances to spread would weaken the barrier between the physical world and the realm of demons. But here's what's really terrifying. This wasn't some rare, extreme case. The Persian Empire had an entire bureaucracy dedicated to scent monitoring. Think TSA agents, but instead of checking for weapons, they're checking whether your perfume might invite demonic possession. These religious inspectors would show up at markets, at public baths, at religious festivals. They had trained noses that could identify hundreds of different fragrances and their spiritual classifications. They carried around little vials of approved scents for comparison, like some kind of aromatic field guide to salvation and damnation. And the penalties weren't just execution. Depending on the severity of your olfactory transgression, you might be banned from entering fire temples, which effectively cut you off from the religious life of the community. You might have your trading licenses revoked. Your children might be denied education. Your family might be forced to move to the outer provinces where the scent laws were less strictly enforced. The whole system created this atmosphere of paranoia where people were constantly second-guessing their personal hygiene choices. Mothers would smell test their children before sending them to school. Merchants would carry certificates proving their perfumes were religiously compliant. People would bathe multiple times a day just to make sure they didn't accidentally retain any forbidden fragrances. But the religious dimension was just the beginning. Because once you've established that the government has the right to control what people smell like for spiritual reasons, it's a very short step to using that same control for political purposes. And let me tell you, the Persian court turned perfume regulation into an art form of oppression. The great king, and we're talking about guys like Darius I, who ruled over 50 million people, had exclusive access to certain fragrances that were literally illegal for anyone else to wear. I'm not talking about expensive perfumes that regular people couldn't afford. I'm talking about scents that would get you executed just for possessing them, let alone wearing them. There was this particular blend of ambergris and Iranian saffron that was reserved exclusively for the king. The recipe was known to exactly 3 people: the king himself, his chief perfumer, and the high priest who blessed the mixture. Everyone else who had ever been involved in creating or handling this fragrance, dead, not retired, not sworn to secrecy, dead. Because the Persian Empire operated on the principle that some luxuries were so exclusive that even knowing about them was a crime. Your Chanel No. 5 would have been a death sentence in this world. Not because it smelled bad, but because it smelled too democratic. The idea that any random person could walk into a store and buy the same perfume as someone wealthy was absolutely incomprehensible to the Persian aristocracy. But here's where it gets really twisted. The court didn't just use perfume to display status, they used it as a weapon. Persian nobles had figured out that they could destroy their enemies not through traditional assassinations or political scandals, but by manipulating their scent profiles. Let me tell you about what happened to Artabazus, one of Darius's generals. This guy was incredibly successful, maybe a little too successful for the comfort of some of the other court nobles. So they hatched this plan that was diabolical in its simplicity. They knew that Artabazus had a weakness for this particular rose water that came from Damascus, not illegal, but definitely on the expensive side and associated with a certain level of luxury. So they started a whisper campaign suggesting that Artabazus was wearing fragrances that were above his station. They planted evidence in his quarters, little vials of progressively more exclusive perfumes. They bribed servants to testify that they'd smelled unauthorized scents in his private chambers. The beautiful thing about this strategy, from the conspirators' perspective, was that it was almost impossible for Artabazus to defend against. How do you prove you weren't wearing a particular perfume 3 weeks ago? How do you demonstrate that a scent in your room came from someone else? Within 6 months, Artabazus went from being one of the king's most trusted generals to being executed for olfactory insubordination. That's not even a real crime in most places, but in Persia, it was enough to end your life. And Darius himself was completely paranoid about this stuff. The guy had food tasters, bodyguards, people whose entire job was to make sure his wine wasn't poisoned. But he was equally worried about scent-based assassination attempts. He believed that certain fragrances could be used to carry curses, or to make him more susceptible to mind control, or even just to signal to potential assassins that he was in a particular room. There are records of Darius having people executed just for wearing the same perfume 2 days in a row in his presence, because he was convinced that repetitive scents were some kind of psychological warfare designed to make him let his guard down. The king had a team of what we might call scent guards, people whose job was to monitor the aromatic environment around him at all times. These guards could identify every person who had been in a room based on their lingering fragrance. They maintained detailed records of who wore what, when, and for how long. And this created this incredibly paranoid atmosphere where court politics became inseparable from perfume choices. Nobles would spend fortunes hiring perfumers to create signature scents that couldn't be easily copied or counterfeited. They would change their fragrances seasonally, not for fashion reasons, but to make it harder for spies to track their movements. Some of the smarter courtiers figured out that they could use this system to their advantage. They would deliberately wear controversial, but not quite illegal fragrances to signal their rebellious credentials to potential allies, while being careful to stay just within the bounds of what was technically permissible. Others used perfume as a form of economic warfare. Because Persia controlled so many of the world's perfume trade routes, wealthy nobles could manipulate the supply of certain fragrances to damage their enemies' social standing. If you knew that your rival's signature scent came from a particular supplier, you could buy up all the supply and force them to either go without their trademark fragrance or risk wearing something that might be interpreted as socially inappropriate. The whole system was designed to keep everyone off balance, constantly worried about whether their personal grooming choices might be interpreted as a political statement. And the genius of it, from the government's perspective, was that it made everyone complicit in monitoring everyone else. Because if you didn't report someone for wearing suspicious perfume, you could be accused of being part of the conspiracy. Now, imagine you're a merchant trying to make a living in this system. You've got access to the most incredible fragrances the world has ever known. There's massive demand from people who are literally desperate to smell good. And every single transaction could get you killed. This is the world that Persian perfume traders lived in every single day. Think Amazon delivery, but if they caught you with premium shipping, you died. The trade routes that Persian merchants had to navigate weren't just dangerous because of bandits or bad weather, though there was plenty of both. They were dangerous because the scent laws changed depending on which province you were in, which local governor was in power, and sometimes which day of the week it was. A fragrance that was perfectly legal in Babylon might be considered heretical in Persepolis. A perfume that the governor of Syria encouraged might get you executed in Armenia. And here's the kicker: you wouldn't necessarily know about these regional variations until you were already in trouble. Let me tell you about Cyrus, not the Great, just a regular guy trying to make a living trading in aromatic oils. Cyrus had built up the successful business importing jasmine essence from Egypt and selling it to wealthy families in the Persian heartland. Completely legal, above board, all the proper documentation. But in 518 BCE, there was this massive political shakeup that nobody really talks about in the history books. What we now call the Great Saffron Scandal. Turns out that some of the regional governors had been taking bribes to allow certain questionable fragrances into their territories. When the central government found out, they didn't just punish the governors. They retroactively declared that any fragrance that had been approved by these corrupt officials was now considered contraband. Overnight, Cyrus's entire inventory became illegal. We're talking about thousands of small vials of jasmine oil that he'd bought legally, transported legally, and stored legally, and now possessing any of it was a capital offense. He couldn't sell it. He couldn't return it to his suppliers in Egypt. And he definitely couldn't throw it away because the scent would linger, and people would know he'd been handling forbidden fragrances. So what did Cyrus do? He tried to smuggle his inventory out of the empire and sell it in the Greek territories where the scent laws were more relaxed. But here's the thing about trying to smuggle perfume. It's really hard to hide. You can bury gold, you can disguise weapons, but you cannot mask the smell of several gallons of concentrated jasmine oil. Cyrus was caught at a border checkpoint, arrested, and executed. His entire extended family was banned from the fragrance trade. The city where he'd been based, a thriving commercial center, lost so much business that it basically became a ghost town within 5 years. And this wasn't some isolated incident. The Great Saffron Scandal destroyed hundreds of merchants and completely reshuffled the economic geography of the Persian Empire. Cities that had been built around perfume trade suddenly found themselves cut off from their primary source of income. New trade routes had to be established, new relationships had to be built, and everyone had to operate under the assumption that the rules could change without warning. But here's what's really wild. This created opportunities for some truly entrepreneurial criminals. There were people who figured out that they could make more money smuggling illegal fragrances than most merchants could make selling legal ones. We're talking about underground networks that operated like drug cartels, except instead of cocaine, they were moving frankincense and ambergris. These black market perfume operations were incredibly sophisticated. They had lookouts, they had safe houses where they could store inventory without the smell escaping. They had couriers who knew how to mask their scent while transporting goods. Some of them even had corrupt officials on their payroll who would tip them off about upcoming raids. The most successful of these operations was run by a woman known only as the Rose. Nobody knows her real name because she was smart enough never to use it. The Rose figured out that she could use the empire's own trade route system against itself. She would purchase legal fragrances in one province, transport them to a region where those same fragrances were illegal, and sell them at massive markups to people who were willing to take the risk. But the Rose's real genius was in her distribution network. Instead of selling to individual customers who might get caught and betray her, she sold exclusively to other merchants who would then mix her illegal fragrances with legal ones in ratios that were hard to detect, but still provided that extra luxury scent that wealthy customers craved. For almost a decade, the Rose operated the largest illegal perfume network in the Western Persian Empire. She had safe houses in 12 different cities. She employed over 100 people, and she was personally responsible for supplying forbidden fragrances to some of the wealthiest families in the region. She was never caught, as far as we know. She retired wealthy and died peacefully of old age, which makes her one of the most successful criminals in Persian history. But for every Rose who beat the system, there were hundreds of merchants like Cyrus who got crushed by it. The Persian perfume trade was simultaneously the most profitable and most dangerous business in the ancient world. But if you think the perfume politics were complicated for men, just wait until you hear what women had to deal with. Because in the Persian Empire, being a woman who wanted to smell nice wasn't just about following religious law or avoiding political scandal. It was about navigating a system that simultaneously demanded you be attractive enough to be valuable, but not so attractive that you became a threat. Dating apps have nothing on Persian court matchmaking, and the stakes were literally life and death. Let's start with the royal harem, because that's where this whole system reached its most twisted extreme. The great king's wives and concubines had access to perfumes that most people couldn't even dream of. We're talking about fragrances made from ingredients so rare and expensive that a single bottle could fund a military campaign. But here's the catch: using these perfumes was essentially a form of biological warfare against other women in the court. See, the harem wasn't some peaceful paradise where women lounged around eating grapes. It was a pressure cooker of competition, where your ability to catch and keep the king's attention directly determined whether you lived in luxury or died in obscurity. And one of the primary weapons in this competition was scent. Each concubine was assigned a signature fragrance by the queen mother, and yes, that's exactly as controlling as it sounds. These weren't chosen based on personal preference or what smelled good on a particular woman's skin. They were strategically selected to create a hierarchy of attraction that the queen mother could manipulate to control who got access to the king and when. The most junior concubines got basic rose water. Pleasant enough, but nothing that would make the king remember them specifically. The more senior wives got access to progressively more exotic scents. Sandalwood from India, frankincense from Arabia, eventually working their way up to the really exclusive stuff like ambergris and rare musks. But here's where it gets really dark. The queen mother could destroy any woman in the harem simply by changing her fragrance assignment. If you were wearing jasmine and suddenly you were told you had to switch to mint, everyone in the court knew you'd fallen out of favor. And once you'd lost the queen mother's protection, the other women would circle like sharks. Let me tell you about Roxana, not Alexander's wife, a different Roxana who lived about 50 years earlier. This woman was brought into Darius's harem from one of the conquered Greek territories. She was incredibly beautiful, but more importantly, she was smart. She figured out that the fragrance hierarchy was just another system to be gamed, and she was determined to game it better than anyone else. Roxana started experimenting with mixing her assigned rose water with tiny amounts of other scents. Not enough to be obvious, but just enough to create a signature blend that was uniquely hers. She would save her hair clippings and perfume them with her custom blend, then leave them in places where the king would encounter the scent and associate it with her presence, even when she wasn't around. For almost 2 years, this strategy worked perfectly. Roxana rose through the harem hierarchy faster than any woman in recent memory. She caught the king's attention, held it, and eventually earned the right to wear progressively more exclusive fragrances as her status increased. But Roxana made one critical mistake. She got greedy. Instead of being satisfied with her elevated position, she started secretly trading with merchants outside the palace to acquire ingredients that weren't available even to high-ranking concubines. She wanted to create a scent so intoxicating, so memorable, that the king would be unable to resist her. The problem was that some of these ingredients were on the forbidden list, not just for religious reasons, but because they were associated with foreign courts that Persia was potentially at war with. When the queen mother's spies detected traces of these unauthorized fragrances on Roxana, it wasn't just seen as competition within the harem. It was treated as potential espionage. Roxana was executed for excessive beauty enhancement, literally, for trying too hard to smell good. Her death sent a message to every other woman in the court that there were limits to how attractive you were allowed to be, and crossing those limits would be treated as an act of rebellion against the natural order. But it wasn't just the royal women who had to navigate this system. Persian society had very specific ideas about how different types of women should smell. And stepping outside those boundaries could have serious consequences for anyone. Married women were expected to wear modest, domestic scents, things associated with the home and family life. Lavender, light florals, maybe a hint of vanilla. Anything too exotic or seductive could be interpreted as a sign that you weren't satisfied with your marriage, which could lead to questions about your loyalty to your husband and, by extension, to the social order. Unmarried women faced an even trickier balancing act. They needed to smell attractive enough to be marriageable, but not so alluring that they seemed promiscuous. Too much perfume and you were trying too hard. Too little and you weren't trying hard enough. And the definition of too much and too little could change depending on your social class, your family's political connections, and even the time of year. The system even extended to the men who worked in the women's quarters. Eunuchs who served in the royal harem were required to wear specific fragrances that were designed to be completely sexually neutral, scents that wouldn't enhance their masculinity or femininity, but would mark them as belonging to this separate, in-between category. But some of these eunuchs figured out that their unique position made them perfect spies in the perfume wars that constantly raged through the women's quarters. They could carry messages between rival factions, smuggle unauthorized fragrances, even poison perfume supplies without being suspected, because everyone assumed they had no personal stake in the competition. But here's where this story gets really insane. The Persian obsession with controlling perfume didn't stay within their borders. It became a driving force behind some of the most brutal military campaigns in ancient history. We're talking about full-scale wars fought over the right to smell good. Chemical warfare, ancient style, except instead of poison gas, they were weaponizing jasmine and frankincense. The Arabian Peninsula was essentially the OPEC of the ancient perfume world. This region controlled the production of frankincense and myrrh, two substances that were absolutely essential for Zoroastrian religious practices and Persian court culture. But the Arabian kingdoms weren't just passive suppliers. They knew exactly how dependent the Persian Empire was on their products, and they were not above using that dependence as a political weapon. In 516 BCE, the kingdom of Saba, where the Queen of Sheba supposedly came from, decided to test just how far they could push the Persians. They didn't cut off the frankincense supply entirely, because that would have been too obviously an act of war. Instead, they did something much more subtle and much more effective. They started mixing their frankincense with additives that would subtly change its scent profile. Not enough to make it obviously different, but just enough that the Zoroastrian priests would notice that something was off during their religious ceremonies. The Persians couldn't prove that the Arabians were deliberately sabotaging the incense, but they also couldn't ignore the fact that their most sacred rituals were starting to smell wrong. This created a crisis in the Persian religious establishment. Were the gods rejecting their offerings? Had they somehow fallen out of favor with Ahura Mazda? Or were their suppliers actively working against them? Darius's response was swift and absolutely brutal. He launched what historians now call the First Arabian Incense War, a campaign that lasted 3 years and involved over 100,000 Persian troops, all because some Arabians had decided to mess with his empire's perfume supply. But here's what made this conflict really different from typical ancient warfare. This wasn't about conquering territory or capturing slaves or looting treasures. This was about securing control over specific aromatic compounds. The Persian military wasn't just trying to defeat the Arabian armies. They were trying to capture and interrogate perfumers, raid fragrance workshops, and steal the closely guarded secrets of incense production. The Arabians, fought back using tactics that were specifically designed to exploit the Persian obsession with scent. They would retreat from cities, but not before burning all the perfume, workshops, and destroying the aromatic gardens. They knew that even if the Persians captured the territory, it would take years to rebuild the infrastructure needed to produce the fragrances they needed. Even more diabolically, the Arabians started using scent as a form of psychological warfare. They would leave behind containers of perfumes that smelled incredible, but were actually made from ingredients that Zoroastrian religious law considered spiritually contaminating. Persian soldiers would find these abandoned perfumes, use them without thinking, and then discover that they had unknowingly violated their own religious laws. This created massive morale problems in the Persian army. Soldiers were constantly worried that they might accidentally contaminate themselves. Officers spent more time managing religious purification rituals than planning military operations. Some units became so paranoid about spiritual contamination that they refused to enter captured Arabian cities at all. But the Persians weren't the only ones who understood the strategic value of perfume. During the famous siege of Babylon in 539 BCE, the defenders used one of the most bizarre defensive strategies in military history. They burned their entire city's supply of perfumes and incense in a massive bonfire that lasted for 3 days. Idea was that the smoke would carry the scent of these valuable fragrances across the Persian siege lines, reminding the attacking soldiers of what they were destroying. It was essentially an early form of propaganda. Look what your empire's aggression is costing the world. But the defenders miscalculated. Instead of making the Persian soldiers feel guilty, the smoke made them absolutely furious. These were fragrances that many of them would never be able to afford, being destroyed in front of their eyes by people they were already planning to conquer. It turned what might have been a negotiated surrender into a massacre. When Alexander the Great finally conquered the Persian Empire, one of the things that shocked him most wasn't the gold or the jewels or the military technology. It was the complexity of the Persian perfume culture. The Macedonians were used to thinking about scent as a luxury, but the Persians had turned it into a science, a religion, and a weapon all at the same time. Alexander actually tried to adopt some Persian fragrance practices as a way of legitimizing his rule over the conquered territories. But his own soldiers were so disturbed by their king's sudden interest in exotic perfumes that it contributed to several near mutinies. To the Macedonians, Alexander's adoption of Persian scent culture was a sign that he was losing his Greek identity and becoming corrupted by foreign influences. When the Persian Empire finally collapsed, the knowledge and infrastructure of their perfume culture didn't just disappear, it scattered. Persian perfumers fled to different parts of the Mediterranean world, taking their expertise with them. Former court officials who had managed the empire's scent bureaucracy ended up establishing perfume workshops in places like Alexandria and Damascus. But they also carried with them the Persian understanding that perfume could be a tool of political control. The idea that governments could and should regulate what people smell like didn't die with the Persian Empire. It just went underground, waiting for the right conditions to resurface. But here's the thing about trying to control something as personal and sensual as smell. People will always find ways to resist. And in the Persian Empire, that resistance took forms that were both beautiful and absolutely terrifying, like speakeasies. But instead of hiding booze, they were hiding jasmine. The underground perfume resistance wasn't organized by political dissidents or religious rebels. It was started by ordinary people who just missed smelling the way they wanted to smell. Mothers who wanted to wear the same perfume their own mothers had worn. Craftsmen who took pride in scents that had been part of their family traditions. For generations, young people who were tired of having their personal choices dictated by bureaucrats who had never met them. These weren't hardened revolutionaries. They were perfume enthusiasts who got radicalized by their own government's insane policies. The most famous of these underground networks was called the Garden of Memory, though that name wasn't used until decades after the empire fell. At the time, members just called each other gardeners, and they communicated through scent-based codes that were so subtle that even the Persian scent police couldn't detect them. Here's how it worked. Let's say you were walking through a market in Babylon and you caught a whiff of a very specific blend, maybe rose water with just a hint of cardamom and the faintest trace of cedar. That combination was code for "I am a gardener and this is a safe place." If you were also part of the network, you might respond by wearing a complimentary scent the next day, something that would harmonize with what you'd smelled, letting the other person know that you'd received their message. These gardeners had turned the entire Persian Empire into their communication network. They could pass messages across thousands of miles using nothing but carefully orchestrated scent signatures. A particular perfume worn in Damascus could trigger a response in Persepolis 2 weeks later, as the news traveled along trade routes through gardeners who recognized the coded fragrance. But the Garden of Memory wasn't just about communication. They were actively preserving forbidden perfume recipes. See, the Persian authorities had systematically destroyed most of the written records about unauthorized fragrances. They'd burned libraries, executed perfumers, and made it illegal to teach certain scent-making techniques. The official goal was to erase these forbidden fragrances from human memory entirely. The gardeners said no. They weren't going to let the government steal their aromatic heritage. Instead of writing down the recipes, which would have been evidence that could get them all executed, they developed this incredibly sophisticated system of memorizing perfume formulas through sensory association. Each gardener would specialize in remembering a particular category of scents. One person might be responsible for all the rose-based formulas, another for musks, another for spice blends. But here's the really ingenious part. They didn't just memorize the recipes individually. They created these group memory sessions, where multiple gardeners would come together to reconstruct complex fragrances through collective recollection. One person would remember the base notes, another would contribute the middle components, a third would add the final touches. No single person knew enough to recreate the complete perfume, but together they could preserve knowledge that the empire was trying to destroy. These memory sessions were incredibly dangerous. Getting caught participating in one was essentially a death sentence for everyone involved. So the gardeners developed elaborate security protocols that read like something out of a spy novel. They would meet in places where strong natural scents would mask any perfume odors near spice markets, in flower gardens, next to bakeries where the smell of bread would overwhelm more subtle fragrances. They would arrive and leave separately, sometimes hours apart. They would wear heavy clothes that would absorb and retain scents, then change into fresh clothing afterward to avoid carrying telltale fragrances away from the meetings. Some of the most dedicated gardeners even developed techniques for temporarily dulling their own sense of smell using natural compounds, so that if they were questioned by authorities, they genuinely wouldn't be able to detect the scents that might incriminate them. In 515 BCE, the Persian authorities discovered one of these networks and decided to make an example of them. What became known as the Perfumers' Rebellion wasn't really a rebellion at all. It was a massacre. Over 200 people were arrested, tortured to reveal the names of other gardeners, and executed in a series of public demonstrations designed to terrify anyone else who might be tempted to preserve forbidden knowledge. But the authorities made a crucial mistake. By executing so many gardeners publicly, they inadvertently advertised the existence of the resistance movement to people who had never heard of it before. Suddenly, ordinary citizens across the empire became aware that there were organized groups working to preserve the aromatic traditions that the government was trying to eliminate. Instead of destroying the garden of memory, the perfumers' rebellion actually caused it to grow. New cells formed in cities across the empire, often led by people who had lost friends or family members in the government crackdowns. What had started as nostalgia for traditional scents evolved into active resistance against Persian cultural control policies. The gardeners also played a crucial role in the slave communities throughout the empire. Enslaved people had even fewer rights when it came to personal scent choices, but they also had access to places and information that free citizens couldn't reach. Slaves working in perfume workshops could steal tiny amounts of forbidden ingredients. Household servants could observe the secret scent preferences of their masters and mistresses. Most importantly, slaves were largely invisible to the Persian scent police, who focused their attention on free citizens who posed more obvious political threats. This made enslaved people perfect couriers for the underground perfume networks. A kitchen slave carrying a message encoded in a scent blend could travel between cities without attracting the kind of scrutiny that would immediately fall on a free merchant carrying the same contraband. Some of the most successful gardener operations were actually run entirely by enslaved people who had figured out that their masters' obsession with controlling their scent choices had created opportunities for subtle forms of resistance. They couldn't rebel openly without facing death, but they could preserve and share forbidden knowledge in ways that were almost impossible for the authorities to detect. When the Persian Empire finally collapsed, these underground networks became the foundation for perfume cultures that spread throughout the Mediterranean world. The gardeners had successfully preserved aromatic knowledge that would otherwise have been lost forever, passing it down through generations of secret practitioners who kept the traditions alive even under the most repressive conditions. So here we are back in 2025, and I want you to think about something for a minute. Tomorrow morning, when you're getting ready for work or school or whatever your day holds, you're going to make choices about how you want to smell. Maybe you'll spray on some perfume, use a scented body wash, put on deodorant with a particular fragrance. And those choices? They're going to send messages to everyone you encounter. Because here's what's wild about this whole Persian story. We never actually stopped using scent as a form of social communication. We just got more subtle about it. Think about how we still have fragrance hierarchies. Walk through the perfume section of any department store, and you'll see it immediately. There's the drugstore stuff that anyone can afford. Then there's the mid-tier brands that signal you're doing okay. And then there are those locked glass cases with the really expensive bottles that basically scream, "I have arrived." We may not execute people for wearing the wrong perfume anymore, but we absolutely still judge them for it. How many times have you walked past someone and thought, "That's too much," or "That smells cheap," or "Wow, they're trying really hard"? How many times have you chosen a particular scent because you wanted to project a certain image? Professional, sexy, approachable, expensive, casual? The Persian Empire understood something that we're still dealing with thousands of years later. Scent is one of the most intimate and powerful forms of communication we have. It bypasses our rational minds and speaks directly to our emotions and memories. And anything that powerful is inevitably going to become a tool for social control. We don't have scent police patrolling our streets, but we do have social codes that are almost as rigid. Try wearing heavy perfume to a job interview and see how that goes. Try showing up to a formal event smelling like you just came from the gym. Try wearing something aggressively masculine or feminine in the wrong context, and watch how people react. The Persian system was extreme, but it was built on the same basic human instincts that still govern our behavior today. We use scent to signal our social status, our personal identity, our availability, our mood, our belonging to particular groups. And we judge others based on how well they navigate these unwritten rules. But here's what I find hopeful about the Persian story. Despite having the most sophisticated and brutal scent control system in human history, they couldn't actually control what people wanted to smell like. The Garden of Memory survived. The underground networks preserved knowledge. People found ways to resist, even at the cost of their lives. That tells me something important about human nature. No matter how much pressure we face to conform, no matter how much authority tries to dictate our most personal choices, there's something in us that insists on the right to be ourselves, even if ourselves just means wearing the perfume. That makes us happy. Next time you spray on your favorite scent, maybe take a second to appreciate the fact that you can make that choice freely. That no one is going to execute you for smelling too good or not good enough or the wrong kind of good. That you get to participate in this ancient human ritual of adorning yourself with beautiful fragrances without fear, but also maybe think about the messages you're sending and receiving through scent every single day. Because whether we admit it or not, we're all still living in the shadow of those ancient Persian perfume politics. We're just lucky enough to live in a time when the stakes are social embarrassment instead of death. Let me know in the comments. Has tonight's story changed how you think about your own fragrance choices? And honestly, I'm curious what you're wearing right now. Because I guarantee you, whatever it is, it's telling a story about who you are and who you want to be. Sweet dreams, everyone. And maybe, choose your scents carefully. Not because you have to, but because you can.